about failures at Abu Ghraib, about Gitmo, and we spoke truth to power when it came to Iraq.
And the failures in Iraq, and we called for the resignation of the Secretary of Defense because of the failures in Iraq.
Yes, you did. Now, here we are, years later. The families have no clue as to what happened to their loved ones, and quit blaming the dead guy. This suggestion that Chris Stevens had fault for his own death. Chris Stevens was in Benghazi because that's where he was supposed to be, doing what America wanted him to do, try to hold Libya together. So there's not going to be any blaming the dead guy. Now, I would like to ask the question of Senator Ayotte. You have followed this as well as anybody. Can you tell us, from your point of view, the unanswered questions and whether or not you think there's evidence that this was a pre-planned terrorist attack versus a protest?
I want to thank my colleagues, the senator from South Carolina and the senator from Arizona, who have been relentless in finding the truth about what happened in Benghazi, where our ambassador and 3 brave Americans were murdered. There are so many questions. I would start with the accountability question that the senator from South Carolina raised. No one's been held accountable. Who's been held accountable for the failures? And if you look at this intel report, it's very clear that the intelligence community, according to this report, provided ample strategic warning that our people in Benghazi were at risk. There were failures, and no one has been held accountable. Why? I would like to know, as I look at these talking points, the question that was raised, why was the reference to al-Qaeda removed from the talking points? Who did that in the context of a presidential campaign? But also, take a look at these talking points. There is no reference in these talking points to a video. Look at the actual language of the talking points. So why is it that the spokesman for the president on January 13th is out there saying that the protests we're seeing, or that this is a reaction to this movie? Why is it that Susan Rice, the ambassador, is on television on multiple shows blaming the video? Not only was it absolutely wrong when she said al-Qaeda was decimated and it was misleading, particularly the fact that al-Qaeda had been removed from the talking points, but there's no reference in the talking points to a video. So who in the administration made up the video story? I think that's important for the American people to know, because it wasn't just Ambassador Susan Rice who relied on the video story. It was our President of the United States who talked about the video, and talked about it, frankly, after the ambassador went on all of the Sunday shows on September 16th. In fact, the President said as late as September 18th, when asked, basically he talked about the video and said, you had a video that was released by somebody who lives here, sort of a shadowy character. Here's what happened, who had made an extremely offensive comment. So here we have the President of the United States as late as September 18th, and then again on September 20th, you have the President saying on Univision Network, responding to the possible involvement of al-Qaeda. He's asked, is al-Qaeda involved? Here's what we do know, that the natural protests that arose because of the outrage over the video were used as an excuse by extremists to see if they could harm U.S. interests. Well, where did the video come from? Even what the intel community came up with, which was deficient and which clearly was subject to political influence because it removed the reference to al-Qaeda, has no reference to a video. So I think there's a lot of questions that need to be answered. But here's the most important question. Why has no one been brought to justice? The President stood on, I believe it was September 12th, and said, we will find out who did this. We will bring them to justice. To those families, those victims, no one has been brought to justice. And in fact, you have people like Abu Khatallah, who is a former commander of Ansar al-Sharia, who's believed to be there that night, sitting in cafes in Libya, giving press interviews, and yet we have, and there's much to believe that he is likely to be involved in this, and many other terrorists. No one's been brought to justice. So why is that? How come no one has the curiosity not only to answer the questions of what happened that night, but also to ensure that justice
Would the Senator yield? I'm trying to find the press statement on September the 10th from a White House official that says, the President has consulted with his national security team, I'm paraphrasing, about the threats we face throughout the world, and we are ready. This is on September the 10th. What does this report tell us about September the 11th? We were so far away from being ready that it is unnerving. So there's a lot to be asked. Why would somebody in the White House issue a statement on 10 September talking about being ready for any contingency anywhere and basically assuring the American people the President's on top of this when clearly he was not?
Another question I'd say to my colleague is the attack went on for a period of some 9 hours, as I recall. And over that period of time, with the hundreds of aircraft that we have and ships and other military capabilities that we have in the area, in the Mediterranean, we were not able to get any real significant help. Now, there's a number of things where a team supposedly landed, were held at the airport, were not allowed to move in, all of that. All of these are questions that have not been answered. General Ham told you and I over the phone that he didn't have any assets that were capable of reaching Benghazi. You mean we don't have a capability over an 8 or 9 hour period to get some relief to an ongoing attack? And again, what was the hang-up that kept people at the airport that finally did get there?
If I could follow along with that thought, it's a very good question. Number one, if the Secretary of Defense and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs publicly testified they knew it was a terrorist attack from the moment it started and told the White House, how did that get lost? How can you start talking about a protest in a video when your own Secretary of Defense and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs in real time tell the White House, but they only spoke to the President once with a pre-scheduled meeting just when the attack started? The Secretary of Defense said,
we still don't know what the President did that evening.
Well, we know after he's answered one question. He said he wanted to be transparent and open and let everybody read the story of Benghazi. We've destroyed a small forest asking questions, and he answered one question finally. Did you call anybody in Libya, Mr. President, that night? No. You got a rescue team held up at the Benghazi airport for 2.5 hours.
Well, may I also add, too, that, you know, the President, we heard testimony that obviously the Secretary of Defense, others knew right away this was a terrorist attack. And let's not forget the 60 Minutes interview where he's asked about that on September 12th. And he says it's too early to tell exactly how this came about. When he's asked directly, is this a terrorist attack, he would not identify it as a terrorist attack. And I will also add this. What's so sad about this is no one's been held accountable. The warnings were there. Not only were the warnings there from the August 16th cable that came from the embassy from Ambassador Stevens saying that the consulate could not withstand a coordinated attack, but what's been lost in all this, when we talk about the New York Times trying to erase al-Qaeda from this, well, the day before that, Ayman al-Zawahiri, the head of al-Qaeda, released a video just before September 11th of 2012. Just before this terrorist attack, which, by the way, occurred on September 11th, of course, which should have given us a pretty direct clue that this was a terrorist attack, but Ayman al-Zawahiri issued this video acknowledging and eulogizing the death of Abu Yahya al-Libi in a drone strike and calling for terrorist attacks. Al-Libi was a Libyan who served as the second in command in al-Qaeda under Zawahiri and was a top leader in the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group. Think about it. the evidence that was there before, not only what we didn't do to protect that consulate, but the warnings that a terrorist attack was coming.
If I may, who was the person who decided to approve a year's lease on this piece of property in July after it had been attacked in June? They blew a hole in the wall that 40 people could go through on June 10th. So somebody said, hey, this is a great site. Let's extend the lease for another year to July 2013, and never reinforced it. Never added any appreciable security, denied all the security requests. This goes on and on. If you want to know about the bridge, great. If you want to know what Chris Christie knew when and what he should have known, great, go for it. All fair. Does anybody care about what our president did that night? Does anybody really care if the President of the United States for 2 weeks talks about a protest that never happened and just all the evidence suggests otherwise? Does anybody really care that the consulate was a death trap and nobody in Washington ever responded? Does anybody care that nobody has been brought to justice? Does anybody in this country care that somebody in the White House on the 14th of September, obviously for political reasons, took the intelligence and turned it upside down? Does anybody care that Susan Rice, who has nothing to do with Benghazi, was the spokesman for the country, telling a story not founded in fact, founded in political advantage? Well, I think Americans do care.
Well, let me ask the senator from South Carolina, does anyone care that the Secretary of State claimed that she knew nothing about this August 16th cable? Didn't know about these cables leading up to the fact that what had happened in Benghazi, the warning, the Red Cross left, the French left, the blown hole through the consulate, the August 16th cable. Yet Secretary Panetta was aware of it. Chairman Dempsey was aware of it when he came before the Armed Services Committee. But the Secretary of State
the Secretary of Defense know about the security environment in a Benghazi consulate and the Secretary of State not? All I can say, it does matter.
No one to this day has been held responsible for the tragic deaths of 4 brave Americans. No one. The Intelligence Committee report, I appreciate. They hold bureaucracies responsible. Individuals are the ones that run bureaucracies. And I'm disappointed that the Intelligence Committee could not have the courage to name the names of the people responsible. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The senator from New Mexico.
Thank you, Mr. President. And let me first thank Senator Shelby and Senator Mikulski for their really hard work on this omnibus appropriations bill, and that's what I'm down here to speak on. The American people sent us here to make choices, sometimes very tough choices. They don't expect perfection, but they do expect us to be fair and to get the job done. Americans are tired of shutdowns, of sequestration, of stopgap funding. And today we are making decisions we were sent here to make. The annual appropriations process is the right way to do the people's business. Instead of kicking the can and passing the buck, lurching from crisis to crisis, I think we are making some significant progress. This was my first year on the Appropriations Committee, and I especially want to thank Chairman Mikulski for her leadership, her unfailing support, and for doing such an amazing job. She once said, "It's not how long I serve, but how well I serve." Senator Mikulski has proven once again on both counts she is truly exceptional. This bill returns some sanity to the budget process in Washington, and I'm pleased that for the most part it does well by New Mexico. New Mexico plays a unique role in our nation's national security. This bill provides strong funding levels for safety and security of our nation's nuclear deterrent, including the important B-61 project at Sandia National Labs. The President's request of $537 million is fully funded. The highly qualified employees at Sandia will continue their vital mission, making sure these weapons are managed safely and securely. This is not something we should shortchange. This bill also provides equally important funding for Los Alamos National Laboratory in northern New Mexico. The workforce there has been reduced in recent years. This bill will stabilize things for 2014. Both of these labs are critical for nuclear security. But they are much more than that. They are also engines for innovation in aerospace, biotech, cybersecurity, and new energy technology. New Mexico is proud to host both of these labs. But the Department of Energy also has an obligation to our states and other states on legacy cleanup. The funding levels do not fully meet our request, but they do provide strong increases over 2013 for cleanup at Los Alamos and at the Waste Isolation Pilot Project in Carlsbad, New Mexico. These cleanup activities are a serious obligation of the federal government and are a source of skilled, well-paid jobs for many New Mexico families. New Mexico is also home to 3 Air Force bases and the Army's White Sands Missile Range. This bill contains nearly $150 million in construction and infrastructure projects, including $60 million for a TRICARE facility at Holloman Air Force Base. These projects will benefit national security, they will create jobs, and will meet our obligations to the men and women who are serving their country. The federal government also plays a very important role in New Mexico's water infrastructure. We are an arid western state. Prudent water management is crucial for our economy. We cannot afford the waste that comes from neglected infrastructure. This bill contains over $120 million in funding for federal water assets in our state and includes the Navajo-Gallup Pipeline and the Middle Rio Grande project. We've been struggling with intense drought. Rural areas and small towns in particular have been deeply affected. Some small communities are seeing their wells run dry. They need help, and they need it now. The $1.7 billion in the USDA Rural Development Water Funding is absolutely essential. This historic drought requires that we rethink how we use water throughout the West. We need to be smart about our strategy, and we need strategies that work for individual communities. That's why I advocated for greater funding for the Water Smart grants, helping local governments and water districts improve water efficiency. The conference report promotes an innovative drought water sharing arrangement along the Rio Grande, where we are facing difficult trade-offs between agriculture, the environment, and urban users. This bill also meets our obligations to our nation's veterans. The backlog at the VA is unacceptable. Frankly, it's an outrage. No veteran should wait a year or more on their claim. This bill funds a 10-part plan to resolve this problem, improving IT infrastructure, better training, and hiring additional personnel. We dedicated $250 million specifically to carry out the VA's Rural Health Initiative to ensure that veterans in rural and remote areas are not left behind. Utilizing telehealth solutions and mobile clinics, bringing veterans the care they deserve without long drives. I will keep fighting for veterans in New Mexico, including those in rural areas, making sure they have access to the health care they have earned. Many veterans are understandably upset with the recent change in the COLA for working-age military retirees. And I'm outraged, too. This cut was included in the recent 2-year budget agreement passed in December. I did not support this provision, and I'm working hard to repeal it. Thankfully, this bill ensures disabled veterans and spousal benefits will not be subject to the cut. Congress has the rest of 2014 to do the right thing. We need to fix this mistake for good for all veterans. This year, I had the privilege to chair the Appropriations Subcommittee on Financial Services and General Government. I'm proud of the work we have done to safeguard our financial system, to protect consumers, to support job creation, and to strengthen our federal courts. The bill provides $112 million for the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, fighting terrorist financing, money laundering, narcotics trafficking, and other illicit financial activity. To protect the public and consumers, the bill fully funds 3 key agencies. For the CPSC, $118 million to help protect the public against risk from injury of consumer products. For the FTC, $298 million to combat consumer fraud, fight identity theft, and promote consumer privacy. For the FCC, $340 million to maintain robust networks for emergency communications, political debate, social interaction, and business transactions. To support job creation, the bill provides $929 million for the Small Business Administration. It also supports the Small Business Development Centers to provide critical guidance to small businesses and emerging entrepreneurs. The bill supports community development in underserved areas, including tribal nations, providing $226 million for the CDFI fund. For the federal courts, the bill provides a much-needed increase, $6.5 billion in discretionary funding, 5% above the fiscal year level of 2013. Budget cuts had forced the courts to downsize and furlough staff. This bill provides the judiciary the staffing and resources it needs for court offices, probation, and pretrial services, and in particular, federal defender offices will be adequately staffed. The bill also calls for significant investments in the government's capital projects. For the first time in 3 years, it provides the General Services Administration a total of $1.653 billion for construction and repair of federal buildings and courthouses. I would like to thank my ranking member, Senator Johans, for his efforts this year. He was friendly, honest, and straightforward, and it has been a real privilege to work with him. Finally, I must thank our subcommittee staff, Mary Ann Upton, Diana Hamilton, Emily Sharp, and like all the committee staff, they have spent time over the holidays, on weekends, and uncounted long hours to help complete the final bill. Now, in closing, I'm very happy to be here talking about the good work of the Appropriations Committee and that good work that has been produced in this bill that's before us for New Mexico and for the nation. But I must mention one problem that remains, and it's a great concern for many of us from the West. Funding for the Payment in Lieu of Taxes program, known as PILT, has expired. These funds compensate counties in New Mexico and throughout the country where the federal government owns a good deal of land, land that cannot be taxed, cannot be developed, cannot be used to help pay for services like roads and schools and public health and public safety. PILT is a lifeline to my constituents in many rural communities in New Mexico. I joined with my friend, Senator Enzi of Wyoming, urging that this crucial funding be included in this bill. Unfortunately, it was not. I realize that PILT has not been in the appropriations bill for several years. In fact, it is preferable for it to receive mandatory long-term funding. But we must find a solution, and we must find that solution soon. I'm calling for PILT to be included in the upcoming Farm Bill Conference Report. It's a common-sense solution to this very real problem. PILT is a long-term funding program. Our rural communities across the West need consistency. They need to be able to plan for long-term projects. Mandatory long-term funding is the only real solution. I hope that my colleagues will work with me on this. And with that, I would urge all of my colleagues to vote yes on the omnibus appropriations bill. And with that, seeing no one wishing to speak, I would note the absence of a quorum.
Mr. President.
Thank you. The senator from Maryland.
Mr. President, if I might respond to the gentleman from New Mexico's very generous comments about the work of the committee, but I'd also like to respond to his comments about PILT. The senator from New Mexico, as other senators from the West, have spoken very eloquently about the need for this payment in lieu of taxes. You know, Mr. President, you're a newcomer here. I'm sure you find that we speak a different language, and our constituents are. So when we use pilt and silt, they wonder if we're tilting in the right direction. But to use plain English and plain needs of states that have large land that is held by the federal government, PILT stands for payment in lieu of taxes. So there's tremendous land owned by the federal government in New Mexico. Am I correct, Senator?
You are absolutely correct, Madam Chair. In some of our counties, 70% of the land in the county is federal government land. And so what happens, as you pointed out, is the federal government says, well, because that can't be developed and it can't be taxed, we're going to pay you in lieu of taxes.
But they haven't been paying you.
No, and the program, which has been in place a very long time, is expired. We've run out of money, and these counties need to be able to plan for their projects. And so that's really where we are on this.
Well, I think this is an issue of fairness and justice. And, Mr. President, I know you come to the Senate as a mayor. I came through the route of starting in the city council. We're local government people, and we know how we had to struggle with unfunded mandates, and many of us have large federal institutions in our state that we love, like the United States Naval Academy and mine, that doesn't pay taxes, but my gosh, we're happy to have them. And I think we have to resolve this PILT issue. I want to say to the gentleman from New Mexico who's spoken ardently and frequently to me about this issue, and to all of the senators from the West on both sides of the aisle, let's work on this. And I pledge to you that as we move on this year's, the fiscal 15, if it's appropriate to be in appropriations, we'll be doing it. But I will also work with other relevant authorizing committees. We've got to crack this problem. It's been languishing far too long, and I think it's a justice issue that if the federal government owns land on which it doesn't pay taxes, prohibits it from then being placed in other developmental use that could be taxed, we have to in some way pay our fair share. Isn't that kind of the gentleman's perspective?
That's exactly my perspective. And these counties, the programs run out. The counties have planned on this money because they've been getting it year after year, and we just have to find a way to do this. And I want to applaud you, Chairwoman Mikulski. There are people, as you know, Western senators, there are Democrats, Republicans. They've all talked to you. We've been talking to the authorizing committees. We've talked to Senator Stabenow at Agriculture in terms of the Farm Bill. We think there's a way this can be worked out. And I'm very encouraged to hear that you also believe it can be worked out and that you're willing to take a look at it next year in the appropriations process and work with the authorizers to see this gets done.
Well, as your colleague and also someone who comes out of local government, who knows the challenges that local governments face, that we work on this, again, on a bipartisan basis. I have spoken to Senator Stabenow. I believe she's willing to proceed on how we could do this as well. So I thank the gentleman for his comments. I think we have a path forward to talk with Senator Stabenow and others who are involved in the Farm Bill and to move forward, and yet move forward on this bill and lay the groundwork for 2015 that we don't have this reoccurring problem.
And I can't tell you how much all of the senators that care about this issue appreciate your hard work on this, and I think we need to stay focused on it because what happens with these counties is they like to know early on, and where the money's coming and how much. If they don't know, then they aren't able to spend it wisely.
Counties are in a different, if I could respond to the gentleman again.
Please.
Counties are in a, municipal government is usually in a different fiscal year. Baltimore City Council began July 1st. The federal government, of course, is October 1st, and we're finally getting settled on January 21st. I mean, now, today's date is January 16th. We're a little behind the schedule, but we're not behind the 8 ball. So we're going to work on this. Before the gentleman leaves, I just again want to thank you for your work, along with Senator Johans, a former Secretary of Agriculture and Governor, I might add, in the way you worked on the financial services. Mr. President, as you know, as a senator from New Jersey, you took the seat of the late and beloved Senator Frank Lautenberg. While you've taken the Senate seat, he took Senator Lautenberg's seat as the chair of the Financial Services Committee. Senator Lautenberg would really be happy to see this today. Though he'd like to be here, the fact that you two are here really is very good. And you essentially got a battlefield promotion, Senator Udall, and I want you to know you proceeded with such diligence. You had constantly the mission of the agencies. You had controversy, enormous controversy at IRS, and you had to step into some very complicated issues. Your faithfulness to your duty, the way you went about it with such diligence and verve is indeed to be commended. I know Senator Lautenberg would feel that his gavel passed to very capable hands, and we want to thank you. And we want to really thank Senator Johans, because he really helped carry the momentum of the committee. This is the way the Senate ought to be, even at a time of great sadness. We were able to continue to do our job. Mr. President, I yield the floor. I note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
The senator from Washington.
I ask unanimous consent to speak in morning business.
The Senate is in a quorum call.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent the quorum call be lifted.
Without objection.
And I ask unanimous consent to speak as if in morning business.
Without objection.
And as the chairwoman of the Appropriations Committee leaves, I want to thank her for her tremendous leadership. I know she's returning in just a minute, but I really want to thank you for your leadership in getting this bill to the floor. Mr. President, I did come today to talk about another topic, and that is that unfortunately for over 1.4 million Americans who have lost their unemployment benefits and the over 70,000 who continue to lose them each week now, the Senate has found itself in an all too familiar place. Once again, some Republicans are refusing to be able to say yes even to the most reasonable of offers, and it's a problem that we have seen in this body too many times. Over the course of the 16-day shutdown last October, we tried time and time again to find compromises to end that manufactured crisis and return federal workers to the job and reopen our federal parks and buildings. But for too long, Republicans refused to listen to the American people and embrace compromise. Instead, they were standing firmly in a partisan corner, and it's a pattern that we saw last year in our efforts to pass a budget. Back in March of last year, as every senator here I'm sure will remember, we spent a week here on the Senate floor in a very open process debating and voting on an amendment after amendment after amendment until the very wee hours of the morning. And on March 23rd, we finally passed our budget after the House had passed theirs the day earlier. And I thought at that time that the next step would be to start a conference as quickly as possible. I thought it was a no-brainer. This is what the American people were expecting, the two sides to get in a room, work out our difference, and avoid another crisis. But, Mr. President, every time we tried to start that budget conference, 21 times here in the Senate, a Senate Republican stood up and said no. They no longer wanted to go to conference. They no longer wanted to follow regular order. They just wanted to obstruct. That, Mr. President, took us to a government shutdown and a debt limit crisis and a lot of pain for families and communities across the country before we could get them in a room with us in a budget conference and agree to the deal that the American people expected. But, Mr. President, that's been sort of the Republican playbook here. They say no for as long as they can. They play politics for as long as they can. They hold out and obstruct for as long as they can until the pressure from angry Americans finally reaches a fever pitch, and then when it's far too late, hopefully come to their senses. Well, Mr. President, it is getting to be far too late for every single American who lost their unemployment benefits. In fact, as last week's unemployment report showed, nearly 500,000 Americans recently gave up entirely. And those who haven't given up spend every single day desperately working to get on the job. And unemployment benefits make all the difference for them and their families while they scour the want ads and pound the pavement and send out resume after resume. In fact, I have heard from many people in my home state of Washington, story after story from men and women. One of those was from a man named Gary who lives in Spokane. Gary wrote to me about his wife, Linda, and how at, quote, 56 years young, with a degree in accounting and an MBA in finance, Linda is still unable to find work. And after exhausting her unemployment benefits, Gary and Linda are now forced to live off his Social Security disability insurance. They are now facing monthly medical expenses and rent over $1,000 a month just to stay healthy and keep a roof over their heads. Gary's benefits cover about $900 of those expenses. So, with each passing day that this Congress fails to act, Gary and Linda find themselves further and further behind. And Gary concluded in his note to me with a simple plea written in all capital letters that said, quote, please, please, please help. I also recently heard from a woman who was laid off from her job at a plant in Keyport, Washington. She told me, quote, this year I have applied for over 200 jobs. And in spite of a stellar resume, I've only gotten 4 phone interviews. I've lowered my standards throughout the year. I've applied for jobs far below my pay grade to no avail. My husband and I have had to claim bankruptcy, and I truly worry about losing my home and displacing my children. These are real people, Mr. President, as you well know. I've heard from Tracy. She's a former executive assistant, 20 years experience in Everett, Washington. And after taking time off from work because she had to care for her dying mother and a daughter who was suffering from bipolar disorder and drug addiction, Tracy found herself without a job. And after her mother passed away, Tracy fell ill, and it made it really hard for her to look for work. So while Tracy was receiving unemployment benefits that were barely enough to cover the care her daughter required, she was just barely making it. She told me that now she cannot afford food and has lost over 50 pounds. She spends every day searching high and low for one break, and she told me, quote, I just need some time for someone to give me a chance. A chance, that's all she's asking us for. That's all they're asking, all of these people. They don't want a handout. They don't want to be a burden. They need support while they get back on their feet and on the job. And we, here in the Senate, need Republican support to do that. We're ready and willing to move forward. We have worked to find compromise, and when Republicans wanted this extension to be paid for, even though it has been expended time and time again without pay-fors under Republican Congresses and Republican presidents, we said, okay, we'll try and find that. But, Mr. President, that wasn't enough. When Republicans signaled that they didn't want to pay for an extension by closing tax loopholes for the wealthiest Americans, we again looked to find a compromise. And when we put forward savings from policies that have either been agreed to by both sides or have been taken from proposals championed by Republicans, they once again said wasn't good enough. When they asked for amendments, we offered amendments. They again said no. Mr. President, unfortunately, Republicans have now reverted once again to pure politics aimed not at the vast majority of the American people who want to see this extended, but instead squarely at their most conservative audience possible. And nowhere is that more evident than in the pay-fors they have come here to offer, whether it's the Minority Leader's amendment that predictably seeks to undercut health care reform, or the AOT amendment, which is a very disturbing signal that after joining us in passing comprehensive immigration legislation, Republicans are now doing a complete 180 on immigration in an election year. In fact, Mr. President, with that amendment, Senate Republicans are now indicating that they are actually going to begin targeting U.S. citizens, children who are U.S. citizens, simply because they were born to undocumented workers. And I think that's shameful, and I'm shocked that we've gotten to this point. Mr. President, these policies aren't going anywhere. Republicans know that. And in the end, all they amount to is nothing more than delaying tactics while American families' lives are hanging in the balance. And make no mistake, families across the country really are teetering on the brink today. In fact, nowhere is that more clear than the last heartbreaking story that I came here today to share with all of you. I got this yesterday. It was from a woman named Sheila, who for the last 13 years has worked a middle management job at a national corporation in my state. She started her letter by saying, and I quote, "I've never written to any government official, but I'm compelled to do so today." And then she told me how she and her husband and 2 children had lived a fairly comfortable life. But all that changed last year when her employer decided to downsize, and Sheila was one of the many Americans who was laid off. Her husband, who works in real estate, was struggling in a very weak market, as we all know. Suddenly, Sheila's family of 4 found themselves relying on just over $500 a week in unemployment assistance. Having graduated from college and business school, Sheila, like so many others who found herself in need of these benefits, wrote, and I quote, "Never in a million years did she think she would be in that spot." She said, quote, "I've worked for so many years, paid my taxes, did the right thing for others. Now I need help." In October, Sheila's family lost their house. They're now renting. They don't know if their daughter will still qualify for the student loans she's currently receiving. Sheila's checking account is now overdrawn. Her car payments are past due. She started getting notices from her utility companies. And as my staff talked with her yesterday, she said she was headed out the door to apply for food stamps. Mr. President, because of Republicans' refusal to work with us, we will once again be going home to constituents like Sheila to explain why this extension hasn't gotten done. I know that I'll be pointing out the fact that we've compromised time and time again to try and get something done here, that we have all but begged Republicans from the start to work with us on this effort. But I can't help but wonder how Republicans are going to explain their actions. And while I normally don't come here to the floor to give advice to my friends on the other side of the aisle, I'd certainly like to suggest that they don't stare into the eyes of someone who just had to apply for food stamps for the very first time in their life and explain that they can't act until Obamacare is destroyed. And I hope they don't tell those who are about to lose their home that they can't help them until they find a way to cut child care credits for U.S. children. And I hope they don't tell Americans who spend their days applying for jobs and working hard that pay a fraction of what they had been making, that they will only be willing to help if all of their political demands are met. And, Mr. President, I especially hope that they don't think that making arguments about procedure or amendments or arcane rules of the Senate that only people here in D.C. pay attention to is an excuse for walking away from 1.4 million Americans at a time when all they want to see is results. Mr. President, what I do hope is that the experiences they have coming face to face with these families will change their tone when they come back here in a week. I hope the stories like the ones that I shared here today will once again be the pressure that Republicans have required over and over again to finally act. And I hope that soon they will join us in passing our nonpartisan, common-sense bill and finally deliver some certainty and some security for struggling Americans who deserve it. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Will the gentlelady yield for a question? First of all, I'm going to thank her for the outstanding work she did on the Budget Committee, because without that budget that you worked so diligently with on a bipartisan basis and with Paul Ryan, enabled us to have the allocation for discretionary spending that enabled us to come here today to make sure the government will function, that it will work as hard as the taxpayers who pay for it, and that we will have no government shutdown and no crisis environment. So I really want to thank the gentlelady. The other is, in your role as the chair of the Subcommittee on Transportation and Housing, has this gentlelady had a chance to look at what she thinks will be the positive job impact of what you've been able to do? Because the gentlelady funds the transportation funding for the United States. Those Tiger grants that are so important, like to Maryland and the Port of Baltimore, and also the issue related to housing. In my own hometown, the renovation of housing for the elderly. Many of it was built in the 70s and 80s under Presidents Carter and Reagan. They need to be rehabilitated. They need to be reformed. They need to meet new ADA standards, all of which would put men and women to work, where in my state, the job rate among construction workers is enormously high. So building bridges and building homes would sure go a long way. Has the gentlelady had a chance to look at any of that?
Well, Mr. President, let me respond to the chairwoman of the Appropriations Committee. And I came here to the floor today to talk about millions of Americans who are in need of extended unemployment benefits. But I would tell you, everyone I have ever talked to on unemployment would much rather have a job. And the question that you asked me is about, in my role as chair of the Subcommittee on Transportation and Housing, and the bill that we are about to pass here in the Senate will have an impact on creating jobs and building that infrastructure so that people have that job certainty. It is extremely important. In the transportation side of my appropriations bill, the Tiger Grant program that you have described will bring not only jobs to communities, but real projects that will help build a foundation for future economic growth. There is there's no one who questions that transportation infrastructure brings jobs today, provides economic development for the future, and is absolutely the way that people get to work and home in a timely manner, bringing certainty for so many families that we know. That is a critical part of my subcommittee. The other part of my subcommittee, as you mentioned, is the housing issues that are so important. And I think most people forget that if you don't have a place to live, it's pretty hard to go to work. Providing some of these programs that we do, like Section 8, some of the reforms that we put into here, are just absolutely critical for so many Americans to be able to have the stability to get out and get a job, so that we don't have to be arguing over unemployment extension here, but actually how we can make the investments so that this country can work and survive. So I hope that we can provide those extensions today as we struggle to get back on our feet, but meanwhile pass this critical bill that you have authored so that we can provide jobs and economic support, which is what people really want.
I thank the gentlelady for her tireless effort. And, Mr. President, I'd like to just comment on the work that the gentlelady from Washington State did in her role chairing the subcommittee on transportation and housing. What a bipartisan effort that subcommittee was. It was the gentlelady from Washington State, Senator Murray, and the gentlelady from Maine, Senator Susan Collins. They worked on a bipartisan basis on transportation, that's what the committee funds, and on housing. Now, it's housing that is primarily related to meeting compelling human need. It also has the money for community development block grants. Going back to the days when I referred to you as Mr. Mayor, now Mr. President, the providing office, we know, City Council Barb and formerly Mayor Booker knows what community development block grant money means in our local communities. In my state, community development block grant money is key to local governments solving local problems without a one-size-fits-all from Washington. What I like about the community development block grant money, its criteria for funding is it has to deal with blight, it has to deal with unemployment, it has to meet compelling human need, and whatever they do, it also usually results in good paying jobs in construction. But it's not decided by Washington, thou shalt build such and such under such and such Washington rules. It's decided in Newark, in Baltimore, in Phoenix. And what was so important about the CDBG money in the transportation and housing is the money comes locally. There's federal criteria, again, eliminate blight, deal with unemployment, and has to meet a documented need. But it's decided locally by mayors and city councils, by county commissioners, whatever is the form of local governance. So this is what they did. They worked on a bipartisan basis for adequate funding for CDBG to meet compelling need in the area of housing, particularly housing for the elderly, the so-called Section 202s, many of which were built a long time ago, and now need to be retrofitted and remodeled. Again, meeting need, coming up to the compliance of what we now know in things like universal design to keep people out of long-term care or assisted living. And this is just a wonderful way to meet human need and also generate jobs. So they've done a great job. What I'd also like to comment was the leadership that they provided, and it was across all of the Appropriations Committee. You know, because we're not a committee that makes a lot of fuss, we're not usually a bunch of chest pounders harumphing about a policy. We were once referred to in a major historical book about our work as the quiet guardians of the purse. We're not quiet when we're with each other, but often the work has not been well known or well noticed because we've done it in a tone of solving problems and keeping the problem and not making personalities the problem. That has been done by every single subcommittee in the Appropriations Committee in the Senate. I'm really proud of them, and I think the transportation housing has been an exemplary one. But you'll hear this today from others who will be coming up to speak about it. We've done a good job, and I hope that other senators will come to the floor to talk about the work of the committee. If they have any questions, if they want to debate or comment, we're open to those discussions. I do hope that we can move the bill along. I know that the rules under cloture doesn't expire until tomorrow, but gosh, if we all come and everyone could have their say, I think we could finish today. Might be late, but I think we could finish and then go on with other pressing Senate business. So I urge those who would like to speak on the bill to come to the floor. We have an order here. And while we're waiting, I have 11 unanimous consent request for the committees to meet during today's session of the Senate. They do have the approval of the majority and minority leaders. So, Mr. President, I therefore ask unanimous consent that these requests be agreed to and that these requests also be printed in the record.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. I know some other senators will be coming. I note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
The Senate spending much of the day on a federal spending bill for the current fiscal year. Right now, the government is operating on temporary funding until Saturday. If no agreement is reached on the measure, the government will shut down. The $1.1 trillion omnibus spending bill the Senate's working on passed the House yesterday, 359 to 67, with bipartisan support. The measure would fund the government through September 30th of this year. Votes on the bill could happen today. While we wait for more floor action, comments now from House Speaker John Boehner during his weekly briefing earlier today.
Morning, everyone. You know, the best way to help out-of-work Americans is to create jobs and grow our economy. That's exactly what Republicans are focused on, creating jobs for middle-class families and small businesses. Unfortunately, Democrats seem to resign to higher unemployment in President Obama's economy. The House has passed dozens of pro-growth jobs bills, many of them in a bipartisan fashion. We've passed education and training measures to expand opportunities for young people and the middle class. We passed a bipartisan measure to approve the Keystone Pipeline and the tens of thousands of jobs that would be created as a result. And we're ready to work with the President and Senate Democrats on trade promotion authority to help employers and workers. If the President means what he says about trade promotion authority, I think it's time for him to pull out all the stops. Now, after 5 years in office, we know how the President can be when he's serious about something. He hit the roads, he uses his bully pulpit, and he takes his case to the American people. So if the President is serious in his commitment to getting this important bipartisan legislation passed, he'll do the same on this issue. And we're hopeful that we can pass that bill this year. But instead of looking to work together, the President this week reminded people that he has, quote, a pen and a phone. I would remind the President he also has a Constitution and an oath of office that he took where he swore to faithfully execute the laws of our country. We have a system of government here, a system of laws, and a Constitution that we're all required to abide by. There's no reason that this year can't be a bipartisan year to work on the issue of our economy and get Americans back to work.
You've talked about the need for the President to have a plan to pay for unemployment benefits, which is a Democratic priority, apparently. Tax extenders is arguably a GOP priority. Should those be paid for?
I don't know what we've done in the past. I think we've done both in the past. Listen, when it comes to unemployment insurance, I told the President now a month and a half ago if he had a plan to extend emergency unemployment benefits, I'd consider it as long as it was paid for and if there were provisions we could agree to that would help expand the economy and create more jobs.
So you do want tax extenders to be paid for?
I don't know what the history of that is.
Speaker Boehner, you say you want 2014 to be a year of bipartisanship. It seems that President Obama has shown a new willingness to talk to folks in Congress. He had martinis with Senate Democrats last night. Would you be open to reviving talks of a grand bargain in regards to the debt limit and having personal one-on-one meetings with President Obama in 2014 in a bipartisan spirit?
How many times have we talked about this? Plenty. Listen, the President has not only made clear that he will not negotiate on the debt limit. He's also made clear, as have Democrats here on Capitol Hill, that they won't talk about our long-term spending problems unless Republicans are willing to raise taxes. Republicans are not going to raise taxes. And so we find ourselves in a fairly difficult box when it comes to dealing with our long-term spending problems. The President just won't do it without raising taxes. And so not much really to talk about. No.
On the issue of you,
are we in a quorum call?
We are in a quorum call.
I would ask that it be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Mr. President,